How did a shy Japanese man outplay all of America? The real story of Sony and Akio Morita. In 1958, 4,000 Sony TR-63 radios were suddenly stolen from a warehouse. The warehouse was packed with radios from other brands, but the thieves took only the Sony ones. This was because Sony radios were so much better in quality that they left all other brands far behind. The robbery was talked about on the radio, and the New York Times wrote about it as the largest radio theft in history. The break-in became the main topic of conversation, and as a result, the name Sony became known all over America and was on everyone's lips. Although the theft caused significant damage, about $100,000, it turned out to be a lucky coincidence. The situation created such a buzz that, as a result, 500,000 Sony radios were sold in just 2 years. Before the war, the reputation of Japanese goods abroad was associated with cheap junk and trinkets. The phrase "made in Japan" was printed in tiny letters to avoid embarrassment. But now, stores across America were eager to sell Sony radios. The story of Sony began even earlier, back in the old days, when in 1945 the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan. Thousands of people instantly turned to ashes, and the place became a scorched desert of ruins. The Japanese were shocked and terrified. But there was one military engineer who stayed optimistic, Akio Morita. He told his colleagues, "The Americans are 10 times stronger than us. There's no point in continuing to invent for military needs. We lost this war." At that time, Japan was technologically far behind the rest of the world, stuck in the Middle Ages, crawling behind like a turtle. Morita was obsessed with clever gadgets since childhood. He was amazed when he learned that his friend, the same age as him, had built a radio at home. It seemed like a miracle to him. Wow, even a regular nerd could make such an amazing invention at home. At that time, amateur radio was becoming popular, and everyone was tinkering with electronics at home. Morita caught the bug too, so much so that he was almost expelled from school. When he was at university, World War II broke out, and the whole country went to war. But Morita didn't fight. Instead, he conducted research for the military. There, he met a genius electronics engineer, Masaru Ibuka. Ibuka was a true scientist who could do anything, and they quickly became close friends. When the war ended, the friends went their separate ways. Morita to his hometown, Ibuka to Tokyo. Ibuka immediately started a new business in an empty building, with only 7 people working at first. Tokyo looked like a post-apocalyptic wasteland, and Ibuka barely had enough money to survive. To make ends meet, he sold electric heating pads and was ready to sell anything just to scrape together enough for a bowl of rice. But Ibuka's real goal was to create something completely new, not just primitive gadgets. After the war, the Japanese were hungry for news from around the world, especially from America. But American radio broadcasts were on shortwave, which Japanese radios couldn't receive. So Ibuka invented an adapter that solved this problem, and it sold like hotcakes. The public took notice, and even the press wrote about it. Morita saw one of these articles, recognized his old friend, and wrote him a letter saying he wanted to help with the new business. Ibuka replied, "Of course, come join us." When Morita arrived in Tokyo, he saw their office in a nearly burned out building. It was a sad sight, but everyone was full of enthusiasm, happy to be working, even though their city had just been through hell. They slowly started making money and began planning to create something grand and modern. Business was picking up, and then Morita and Ibuka went to ask Morita's father for permission. His father ran a family sake business, and in Japan, taking the eldest son from the family business was a big deal, involving unspoken commitments and expectations. Morita, his father, was surprised by his son's choice. He didn't like that Morita had chosen physics, thinking it wouldn't help with the family business. Relatives were shocked that the son of a company president was living in such poor conditions. But Morita's father didn't resist and gave his blessing, telling his son to do as he wished. They returned to Tokyo and founded a new company, pooling together about $500, an almost laughable amount, not enough for anything. Most of the money in the country was frozen to fight inflation, and banks refused to give loans. So Morita often had to ask his wealthy father for money, and in return his father took a share in the company. At that time, American propaganda was everywhere, but the Japanese didn't have modern equipment to receive it. That is why Ibuka and Morita created a mixer for radio broadcasting and received an order from the American military. During one of these deals, Ibuka saw an American Wilcox Gate tape recorder and immediately realized that this device was the future and would revolutionize the industry. American music was becoming popular and everyone wanted to listen to it. The idea of creating a tape recorder inspired Ibuka and Morita, but they had no idea how to make magnetic tape. No one in Japan produced anything like it. They didn't have plastic, only cellophane, but even the strongest cellophane stretched and distorted the sound. They even hired chemists, but nothing worked. Then they tried using thick craft paper, cutting it into strips by hand and gluing them together, and cooked up some kind of salt to get magnetic powder, which they mixed with lacquer and applied to the tape. The device was extremely primitive, and the sound quality was terrible, but they were proud of their creation. In 1947, a young musician named Norio Oga became interested in these tape recorders. He asked so many bold questions that he was invited to meet the engineers. Morita loved young, bold people because they brought fresh ideas and new perspectives, so he tried hard to recruit Oga. Oga initially refused but agreed to consult and help improve the sound quality. At first, Ibuka thought Oga was just another cocky kid, but soon realized he was a true expert. The tape recorder they created in the 1950s was huge and heavy, about the size of a box and weighing 35 kilograms, but it worked well. They thought customers would line up for it, but in reality no one bought it. People didn't know what it was for, and it was very expensive, 170,000 yen. They made 50 of them, but sales were a disaster. Ibuka believed that if you made a good product, sales would happen on their own, but there simply was no market for tape recorders, even in America. Morita tried to find a target audience and noticed that courts lacked stenographers. Thanks to his connections, he demonstrated a G-type tape recorder with voice recording in the Supreme Court and immediately sold 20 units. Encouraged, they targeted schools, which also needed such devices, and designed a smaller tape recorder in a stylish case. Orders from schools poured in, and the tape recorder quickly entered the school market across the country. Если все устраивает, продолжу переводить следующую часть. Дай знать, если нужно что-то изменить. With such success, they thought they had struck gold. But Morita noticed that sales of tape recorders were unstable. Sometimes they sold out instantly, other times there was complete silence. The company was still small and could go bankrupt from any market fluctuation. Morita realized they needed to expand beyond Japan, reasoning that it was better to depend on the whole world than on just one country. In 1952, Ibuka went to America to explore how Americans use tape recorders and to see their production methods. However, no one let him into their factories, and the trip was mostly disappointing, except for one thing. He learned about a new invention called the transistor. Western Electric was offering to sell the patent to anyone interested. This caught Ibuka's attention, as his company was full of talented engineers eager to create something new. However, Ibuka ran out of money and had to return to Japan before he could visit Western Electric. Back in Japan, he kept dreaming of getting the license for this mysterious transistor, even though they didn't really know what to do with it yet. At that time, transistors were only used in hearing aids, but what inspired them was that it was something ultra-modern and new. Eventually, through acquaintances, they managed to get in touch with Western Electric, who finally agreed to sell them the patent for the transistor. In 1953, Morita went to New York to sign the agreement. It was his first time in America, and he was stunned by the size and modernity of the country. He thought there was no way their humble Japanese products could ever sell in such a great nation. He even lost confidence and almost turned back, but in the end the deal went through. Now they had to convince the Japanese ministry to let them buy the expensive patent, even though the country lacked foreign currency. Of course, they immediately started making transistor radios, even though it was a huge risk. No one in the world believed in them yet, and they were very expensive. But Ibuka believed it would be a revolution. At that time, people were obsessed with high-fidelity sound, and transistor radios offered clearer sound, were smaller, and didn't overheat like old tube radios. Before they could make a radio, they had to develop their own high-frequency, powerful transistor, which required special equipment and a lot of money. Once again, they had to beg the bank for funds. The bank was skeptical, thinking transistors were just a temporary substitute for tubes. Even Americans laughed at the idea. Ibuka himself went to the bank and gave a passionate speech about how transistors, unlike tubes, didn't wear out because there was no friction. After this, the bank finally agreed. Eventually, they managed to create their own transistor using a phosphorus coding method, essentially reinventing the transistor. By 1955, they had their first transistor radio, the TR-55, ready. Since Americans were wealthy and advanced, Morita went to New York to offer his radio to American wholesalers. But before that, he decided to change the brand name. The original name, Totsuko, was too hard for Americans to pronounce and would have been a marketing disaster. They chose the name Sony from the Latin word sonus, sound, which was short, memorable, and easy to pronounce in any language. The Mitsui Bank was against the new name, arguing that they had spent 10 years building the Totsuko brand, but Morita insisted and left for America. In America, Morita rented a room in a shabby hotel where only the poor and homeless lived, and he ate in cheap diners and cafeterias, not hiding his humble circumstances. He wandered around the city, offering his miracle device to merchants, but many were unimpressed. They asked, "Why make such small radios? Here in America, everyone wants big ones for their huge houses. Why would we need something so tiny? We're not poor." To this, Morita replied, "But every family member can have their own radio and listen to whatever they want in their own room without disturbing anyone." Many Americans thought Morita was crazy, but some understood the value of his idea. One such company was Bulova. They liked the product and said they would buy 100,000 units. Morita was stunned. This was a huge order, several times the value of Sony itself. But then Bulova insisted on putting their own logo on the radios instead of Sony's. Morita refused, as he had promised his team to make the Sony name famous. Bulova was shocked. Only a madman would turn down such a huge deal. They argued that no one knew the Sony name, but Morita replied, "You don't know it now, but you will in 50 years. 2 years later, when Morita returned to the US, his friends told him he shouldn't live and eat like a bum, that Japanese people should show higher status. It was better to rent the cheapest room in a fancy hotel than the fanciest room in a cheap one. Morita started eating in good restaurants, learned about American service, changed his style, and even started going to the theater. In 1957, Morita finally found an American retailer with a chain of 150 stores who liked the radios, and didn't he insist on changing the name. He was ready to order 100,000 radios a year, which was a huge deal for Sony. But Morita told him that 100,000 was too many. They could only handle 10,000 a month, otherwise they'd have to hire a lot more workers and expand production, which was risky if the orders suddenly stopped. The retailer was surprised, as usually the price goes up for smaller orders. But Morita explained their situation, and the retailer agreed to buy 10,000 radios at a low price. Finally, Japanese radios broke into the American market, and consumers liked them. Sony registered its name in 170 countries and territories to protect it. But one day, someone in Japan started selling chocolate under the Sony name, even copying the logo. People thought Sony was in financial trouble. The case dragged on in court for almost 4 years, but in the end, Sony won. Musician Norioka often criticized Sony, never mincing words. One day, he told Morita that his company had too many engineers, was old-fashioned and poorly managed. Morita was surprised, as he thought his company was bold and original. He challenged Oga to come and shake things up. Oga initially refused, saying he needed creative freedom as an artist. But Morita secretly sent his wife to convince Oga's wife, and eventually they persuaded him to join Sony. As soon as he arrived, Oga implemented many unconventional solutions and recruited 40 people from other companies in his first year. Ibuka realized that the days of radio were over and the future was in television. So after radios, they started creating a transistor television. When they released the TV8301 model, Sony received worldwide recognition in 1960. However, this recognition didn't translate into sales, as the TV8301 was too expensive, not color, and often broke down. Televisions were still a luxury item bought only by the rich or eccentric. As Sony became more famous, the Delmonico trading network started focusing on low prices rather than quality. They insisted on using cheaper materials to increase profits, while Morita always believed in making high-quality products. They also refused to sell unfamiliar products. This frustrated Morita, but he tolerated it. However, when Sony released its first transistor television, Delmonico started advertising it without permission, even though the contract didn't mention televisions. Morita felt that if they didn't break ties with Delmonico, disaster would strike, as they would sell the TVs cheaply. He decided to terminate the relationship. which Delmonico resisted, even threatening a lawsuit. Morita had to pay them $75,000 to get them to back off. From that moment on, Morita decided never to work with distributors again. This was a risky move, as they now had to create their own sales network. Morita realized that marketing was a form of communication. Usually, manufacturers stay away from their customers with a long chain of middlemen who don't care about the product. This creates a huge gap between the manufacturer and the customer. This is fine for simple products, but for innovative products, it's not ideal. Morita started building his own sales network, opening a showroom in Tokyo's Ginza district in 1960, where the public could see the products. This store became very popular. They opened a similar store in New York. Morita spent 2 years on the project and finally found a store on Fifth Avenue, which opened in 1962, just before the launch of the mini television. The store was visited by 7,000 people on opening day. The mini televisions caused a boom in the US. Sony couldn't keep up with demand. The New York showroom was tiny, but it became a springboard for entering the global market. Sony gradually expanded into many countries, and wherever they opened their own stores and explained the advantages of their products directly to customers, sales immediately increased. For example, in England, after breaking ties with intermediaries, sales tripled. In Germany, where local electronics were considered the best, Sony products initially sold poorly. But after getting rid of distributors, sales also grew several times over. The popularity of the showrooms in Tokyo and New York convinced Morita to build an 8-story building in Ginza at one of the busiest intersections. It was designed as an ultra-modern building and became the most expensive property in Tokyo at the time, costing almost 3 billion yen, more than the entire capital of Sony. Unlike other Japanese businessmen who stuck together in America and remained outsiders, Morita immersed himself in American society, learning about the country from Americans themselves. He even commuted to the office by bus with ordinary New Yorkers, observing their habits. Eventually, he decided to move to America with his family to understand the American way of life even more deeply. In 1962, he moved to New York, renting a luxurious apartment on Fifth Avenue. He often hosted parties, quickly expanding his network of useful contacts. His office became a laboratory where engineers studied competitors' TVs. By then, Sony was a major producer of black and white TVs, but had no experience with color TVs, while competitors were far ahead. Dealers demanded color TVs, and Sony engineers struggled for years to create one. Only in 1968 did they finally release the Trinitron Color TV. Competitors laughed at it, but the Trinitron turned out to be a super TV with a picture 25% brighter than competitors and a lifespan of up to 30 years. To break free from dependence on bank loans and to fund their own sales network, Sony needed serious investment. The solution was to enter the US stock market, but this required adapting to both Japanese and American financial regulations. The process was long and difficult, but after a year and a half, Sony finally issued 2 million shares on the New York Stock Exchange in 1970, selling 1 million shares in just 1 hour. Sony became the first Japanese company to issue shares in America, inspiring other Japanese companies to follow. Sales in the US kept growing, but shipping TVs across the Pacific was expensive. In 1971, Morita decided to build a factory in the US to produce Trinitrons. This was an unusual move, as most companies were moving production abroad to save costs, but Morita believed it was better to be close to the main market. Sony also faced anti-dumping lawsuits in the US, as American companies tried to block Japanese imports. Building a factory in San Diego turned out to be a smart move. Later, Sony built factories in Barcelona, Stuttgart, and other places, eventually having factories all over the world, except in the Soviet Union. In 1974, Morita was invited to the Soviet Union, where he was shown how TVs were assembled in Moscow and Leningrad. The Soviets wanted to sell TVs in Europe and proposed cooperation, but Morita was shocked by the poor quality and design and refused to work with them. When major US radio stations started using Sony video recorders, Sony realized that ordinary people would also want to record videos at home. They set out to make video recorders compact and user-friendly. Ibuka challenged his engineers to create a cassette the size of a small book that could hold at least an hour of programming. This led to the creation of the revolutionary Betamax video system, which offered the best picture quality. Morita launched a massive advertising campaign in America to explain the benefits of video recordings, believing that television had enslaved people to its schedule. He wanted to show that now viewers could watch what they wanted, when they wanted. However, the head of Sony's American division, Harvey Shane, was reluctant to spend big on advertising, focusing only on short-term profits. Morita insisted, threatening to fire him if he didn't invest in advertising. The Betamax campaign was a success, but American TV companies and studios were furious, claiming that video recorders would cause them to lose millions in licensing fees. They sued Sony for copyright infringement, leading to a legal battle that lasted 8 years. In 1984, the court ruled in Sony's favor, declaring that home video recording was not a copyright violation. However, Betamax lost the market to the VHS format from JVC, which offered longer recording times and cheaper devices. Despite Betamax's superior quality, it was not enough to win over consumers, and Sony's video recorder business eventually became a burden. One day, Ibuka complained to Morita that he wanted to listen to music on the go, but didn't want to carry a huge tape recorder. Morita had a flash of inspiration. They needed to create a small, portable player. At the time, young people in New York carried huge boom boxes on their shoulders, which was inconvenient. Morita trusted his intuition and bet that a portable player would be a hit. He even promised to resign if they didn't sell 100,000 units by the end of the year. To make the device smaller, they removed the recording function and speaker. And when the player with headphones was ready, everyone was amazed by the sound quality. The name Walkman was invented by the youngest employees, inspired by the popularity of Superman in movies. The first Walkman was released in 1979, but journalists mocked it for lacking a recording function, and sales were slow at first. Sony AS marketers responded by recruiting Japanese celebrities to be seen wearing Walkmans and by letting people try the device on the streets. Word of mouth quickly spread, and sales skyrocketed. By 1980, the Walkman was everywhere in New York, becoming a symbol of lifestyle and status. In 1980, Sony sold 500,000 Walkmans, and the next year, 6 million. The Walkman's technology was hard to copy, and by the time competitors caught up, Sony had already sold 20 million units. Olga was invited to Philips, where he saw a laser disc that produced high-quality sound. Philips proposed that Sony join them in developing and promoting the technology. Olga, being a musician, liked the idea, and the compact disc format was born. However, other recording companies saw CDs as a threat to their vinyl records. In 1982, Sony released the world's first CD player, the CDP-101, and started selling music on CDs. Initially, sales were good, but the hype quickly died down. People were still happy with their vinyl records. Sony created a portable CD player, the D50, which caused a sensation. Morita made the player very cheap, even at a loss to get people hooked. Eventually, the CD market took off, and by 1986, CD production surpassed vinyl records. In 1989, Morita bought Columbia Pictures for $3.4 billion, believing that if Sony had owned the studio earlier, they wouldn't have lost the video recorder war. Americans worried that Japan was invading Hollywood, but Morita promised not to interfere with the studio's operations. However, the studio manager spent extravagantly and produced a series of flops, resulting in huge losses for Sony. After suffering a brain hemorrhage in 1994, Morita stepped down as chairman, although he still wielded considerable influence. Under Olga's leadership, economic downturns and a strong yen led to a crisis in 1993. In 1994, Olga implemented a radical reorganization, dividing the company into smaller independent units, each with its own president and unprecedented autonomy. In the 1990s, cassette players started losing popularity, and cheap imitations from China flooded the market. In 1994, the MP3 format emerged, but Sony created its own format, mini-disc, seeing MP3 as a threat to the music industry. Sony's mentality of not invented here prevented them from adopting external innovations, and they forced users into analog bondage with proprietary cables and software. Sony seemed to have lost touch with reality, believing that the only thing consumers wanted was copyright protection. Customers didn't like this and returned the players to stores. The company was stifled by its own success, and the Walkman and Trinitron started losing ground. Sony struggled to let go of its past successes, and for almost a decade, the company floundered. In 1995, Oga chose Nobuyuki Ide as his successor. Ide wasn't an engineer and lacked Morita's charisma. He focused on creating a computer for entertainment, the VAIO, but it was too expensive and never gained significant market share. When the dot-com bubble burst, Ide's plans collapsed. Employees criticized him for destroying Sony's former glory. The company was in chaos, and Ide's restructuring led to organizational disarray and a bureaucratic mess. In 1999, Sony released two new players, a Walkman with a memory card and a VAIO with a built-in music collection, but both received poor reviews. In 2001, Apple released the iPod, which had a better interface and supported MP3 files. Sony couldn't compete. In 2001, Sony Ericsson released a phone with a color screen and music and photo capabilities. But as smartphones evolved, Sony couldn't keep up, and its market share plummeted. In 2004, Sony announced a loss of $1 billion, leading to a stock sell-off. In 2005, Ide resigned, and Howard Stringer, an American, took over. Stringer restructured the company and centralized decision-making. In 2008, Sony closed 11 factories and laid off 10,000 employees. In 2008, Sony released the Xperia phone, a hybrid of a smartphone and a gaming console, but it failed to gain traction. Sony released too many similar models, and despite their reliability, they were too expensive. A series of disasters, including exploding batteries, earthquakes, and tsunamis, caused Sony to lose billions of dollars. In 2012, Stringer stepped down and was replaced by Kazuo Hirai, who sold off assets and cut more jobs. Sony gradually started to recover thanks in part to the PlayStation. In the 1980s, Nintendo was the king of the gaming console market. At Sony, there was an engineer named Ken Kutaragi who was passionate about games and consoles, but Sony didn't even consider entering the gaming market. Norio Oka said, "We're a serious company and these are just children's toys." In 1991, as CDs began to replace cartridges, Sony developed a disk drive and sound chip for Nintendo's console. The two companies combined their technologies into a console called the Nintendo PlayStation, which was supposed to support both discs and cartridges. However, the president of Nintendo didn't like the contract terms, which gave Sony control over the CD technology and a large share of the profits. Nintendo secretly turned to Philips for CD technology, which Sony saw as a betrayal. Oga, deeply offended, decided to enter the gaming market to get back at Nintendo and tasked Kutaragi with developing a new console. Even after founding a new division for PlayStation, many Sony employees looked down on Kutaragi, thinking games were not serious business. Despite skepticism, Sony launched a massive marketing campaign for the PlayStation, focusing on its unique design and 3D gaming capability. Unlike competitors, PlayStation used discs instead of cartridges, and for the first time, games could be saved using memory cards. The console was fast and could play 3D games, which seemed magical at the time. When the 32-bit PlayStation was released in 1994, it was an instant success, crushing competitors who lagged behind due to hardware issues, high prices, and a lack of games. Sony, on the other hand, attracted many game developers, and the real profits came from the games themselves. The first PlayStation sold 1 million units in just 6 months, and by 1996, 5 million units had been sold. Before PlayStation, consoles were seen as toys for kids, and adults were embarrassed to play games. Sony shattered this stereotype, and soon adults around the world were playing games on PlayStation. For the PlayStation 2, Sony aimed for a console that would last 10 years, so they packed it with top-of-the-line hardware. However, this made development difficult for game creators, and for the first couple of years, there weren't many games. The situation improved when Grand Theft Auto 3 was released exclusively for PlayStation in 2001, driving console sales. The PlayStation 2 also included a DVD player, making it more attractive to buyers. After this success, Sony became overconfident and invested $2 billion in developing a new chip for the PlayStation 3, along with an expensive Blu-ray drive. The result was a console that was much more expensive than its predecessor and competitors. Customers were frustrated by the high price and lack of exclusive games. and the PlayStation 3 sold 10 times worse than the PlayStation 2. After this failure, Kutaragi was dismissed. For the PlayStation 4, Sony kept things simple and developer-friendly. In 2013, while competitors struggled, Sony easily outperformed them, selling 1 million PlayStation 4 consoles in the first 24 hours at $399 each. This was seen as redemption for the previous failure, and today, gaming brings in about half of Sony's profits. The PlayStation 5, released in 2022, became Sony's fastest-selling console ever. Sony realized where the real money was and began to focus heavily on gaming. Despite all the ups and downs, the Sony brand remains one of the most recognizable in the world, and people still respect it. The company survived thanks in large part to its unique corporate culture. From the beginning, Ibuka rejected total control over employees, believing that everyone should be truly free and enjoy their work. If anyone needed to be watched, it was the manager, since they could make mistakes for years without anyone noticing. At Sony, Morita made everyone equal, refusing to let managers see themselves as a higher class. Employees were encouraged to act without waiting for orders and to be creative. If a manager was too stubborn and blocked new ideas, Morita published an internal newspaper with job openings, allowing employees to transfer without making a fuss, quickly exposing bad managers. At Sony, you could openly disagree and propose new ideas, even if they were radical. Morita believed that if two people always agreed, there was no point in having both of them in the company. This culture of creative freedom is similar to what Netflix later achieved, preferring to hire one genius for a huge salary rather than 1,000 good employees. Sony's corporate culture encouraged employees to move between departments every 2 years, or even more often if they were especially enthusiastic, so that everyone could eventually find the role that suited them best. People work not just for money, but to find satisfaction in what they do. In most companies, the word collaboration is just lip service, but at Sony, you could boldly say you disagreed with everyone and proposed a better idea. Your opinion could be radical, but you had every right to express it. Once, the chairman of the board, Mikio Tajima, was outraged by Morita's opinion, but Morita stubbornly stood his ground, saying, "If we had the same views, what would be the point of having two of us in the company?" Tajima was shocked by this answer, but in the end he stayed. Interestingly, Sony's corporate culture is in some ways similar to Netflix's, especially in terms of creative freedom, though Netflix has taken it even further, preferring to hire one super genius for a huge salary rather than 1,000 good employees. Despite all the ups and downs, Sony remains one of the world's most respected brands. The company survived thanks to its unique approach to management, its willingness to take risks, and its focus on innovation and creative freedom. Sony's story is a testament to the power of vision, resilience, and the courage to challenge the status quo.